So we'll welcome Josh up to the stage. Josh Kolasch is a second-year master's student in the Integrative Biosciences program at the University of Minnesota Duluth. He works for Dr. Alexis Grindy in the Avian Ecology Lab at the Natural Resources Research Institute, NRI. Josh has worked in a variety of forest ecosystems and is passionate about community ecology and how succession shapes ecological communities. Josh.
Thank you, Clinton. Thank you, everyone, today for coming to listen to me nerd out a little bit about part of my project and I think a really cool way of a different way of looking at the landscape. If at any point I start talking way too fast, just please try to get my attention. I don't think it's going to be an issue, but I can get really excited and just kind of ramble on. So please call me out for it. So just a little outline of the presentation today. I'm going to give a little overview of the relationship between biodiversity and structure, how that shapes habitat heterogeneity and succession, looking at how we typically collect habitat metrics in the field, how we do that, and some of the limitations with just alone using field collected data, and then talk about briefly on LiDAR, talk about why we use LiDAR for habitat modeling, a little overview of my thesis, specifically focusing on black spruce peatlands, and then some different examples of some relationships with stand age and some LiDAR metrics on specialist species. So biodiversity and structure. We often hear a lot about biodiversity. We've recognized as a society that we do value this and we want to value this, but what makes something biodiverse? When I think about biodiversity, I usually think about tropical rainforests and coral reefs, because they're really extreme examples of just really intensified areas of diversity that often is led from this really complex structure. If you go to a rainforest, or you go to a coral reef, you realize there's lots of little nooks and nannies that species can hide in, live in, feed on, and that really increases over time generally with forested ecosystems. Forested ecosystems on Earth harbor about 80% of the world's biodiversity, which is pretty cool, and they've been around for a really long time. So they're really important, and a lot of species have really specialized in these systems. With this figure, representing the boreal forest, we can think about what shapes a forest, really think about time and think about disturbances. So we have, say, a large forest fire that wipes the slate clean. We start with a simple habitat. There's not much complexity in structure because trees are gonna grow back, generally the same age around the same time. But as you go through time, you start getting these secondary disturbances like herbivory, disease, wind throw, these other small events that are really shaping that forest structure over time. And as that increases, just the amount of niches available for different species in that forest also increases. And birds are a great example of focusing on this. When we think about birds and why we study birds, it really is that birds are a great indicator of the environment of the habitat. We know that if you're hearing magnolia warbler sing, there's probably some shorter conifer trees that are in that area that they're really focusing on. And in peatlands, this example with like a black spruce peatland community, we really see how this structure is really tied with succession and these different stages of succession with early, mid, old. You get to the old growth succession stage that we often hear about. And at different stages, you have species, if there's a forest fire, where you have black-backed woodpeckers that are responding to that. You have these structures that all-sided flycatchers might want to perch off with those open areas. As that forest develops, those different species associate with those different structures through time, eventually get into this older, old-growth forest that really in a black spruce peatland and a boreal forest is really just a complex structure that's a collection of these different successional stages. So when we say old growth, it doesn't necessarily mean the entire habitat's old. It's going to be a collection of early, mid, and old successional stages, all within the same little spatial area. And because of this specialization, it also means these species have a really hard time adapting to change. If we go in and cut a forest down in the wintertime, boreal chickadees and Canada jays that cache in those forests, they can't recover from that. And we think about maybe they might just move on. But what happens if you would take away your house and your grocery store and your mode of traveling? It's pretty hard to come back from that. So we have to think about those things. So how do we identify these structures that these birds are tying to? Typical traditional habitat monitoring, if I'm looking at a space to choose an area to monitor for birds, I'm usually going to pull up satellite imagery and usually pair that with a type of land cover database map. We have forest inventory monitoring, National Land Cover Database, a whole sort of different maps that you've probably all used and are familiar with. And that might be where your question stops. You might just want to know the type of cover type that species is using and not want to go more into details. If you want to go more into details, you create plots generally over a landscape that you can scale out, as I don't think it would be pretty hard to measure every tree within a stand. Pretty impossible, actually. These points on here represent a typical like forest inventory plots. How you have for our study, we choose 6 per stand, and with an 11.3 meter radius. So that's an accurate radius of that stand. And you can see how there's a lot of things that you could be missing in here that are really important for species presence and absence. And that leads into like one of the biggest limitations with this, is it really spatially limits our ability to view what habitat features are really important. It's also really expensive and really intensive. If you've walked through a lot of black spruce peatlands or peatlands in general, you know that they're magical places. They're also really hard to move through. You get bog legs, you start moving, your time slows down, and as soon as you feel hard ground again, you're like, whoa, like everything's different. I can actually move at a normal pace. So it takes a lot. And typical inventory maps usually lack a lot of these important features that species are focusing in on. Tree decay, types of different physical structures of wind throw. And with that example, we have the satellite image of this stand, which is an older stand with a canopy height model. You can see that if we just took the 6 plots here, you're missing a whole lot of variation throughout this stand. In this stand specifically down here, we see there was a larger ELB tamarack mortality event, really creating this really complexity of structures, as well as some mistletoe rings that with this canopy height model, you can see these circles in here. But these structures that birds really respond to. That leads us to where this image came from. Too far. With LiDAR. So Kara gave a really good, brief little introduction on what LiDAR is, so I'm not going to repeat really what it is. It's really just a way of collecting a lot of data points over large spatial scales that we can really take away and look at fine scale features with this. Typically, this is done with airborne LiDAR. But there's also terrestrial LiDAR. There's satellite LiDAR, which is up and coming, which is going to be pretty exciting because that's going to be able to allow us to really analyze large areas without having to repay for flights, which get expensive. And from that large point cloud and that 3D map of the forest, you really can take whatever you want from that, whatever your question is. There's a lot of different metrics you can use. If you want to identify what type of cavity trees are important, and you can actually identify those cavity trees from LiDAR with GPS points and really map how that is. Or if you're looking at canopy species or canopy cover, that's also metrics that you can take. Species like, if you're considered about black-throated blue warblers, you know that canopy cover is an important metric, but you also need that understory layer for nesting. You can really capture that with LiDAR. So really, whatever your question is, you can really think about, what do I want to take from this point cloud data? And it can get as diverse as you would like it. And this is why it's really a great tool to use for modeling bird habitat. For its ability to quantify that really fine scale structures that we don't get the chance to look at or really measure without this technology at large spatial scales, as well as identifying these important structural features that these birds are really keying in on. In this example, from 2019, we have some different aspen-associated species, and you can see that with the light green is the canopy, and you can see in the far upper left, the golden-winged warbler. There's early successional forest species, but they still like having those individual trees to sing and perch on in that matrix of structure. And that carries on with chestnut-sided warblers being more of that short edge species, with vireys enjoying that canopy but still being an edge. And as you go all the way to red-eye vireos, as you know, love canopy and love canopy cover. So it's really cool what you can take apart from LiDAR. Okay, why do we care about bird habitats? I probably shouldn't have to ask any people in here that, but without a habitat, you don't have a species. And that's really nerve-wracking because we're losing a lot of our species. This is not a new figure, probably for most people in here. In 2019, Rosenberg et al. Had this really alarming study come out that North America is losing a lot of our birds. You can tell from the angle we've probably been losing birds prior to 1970, but this really just kind of gave a punch in the gut of we need to do something and really figure out how we can stop this trend. And we can see that in northern Minnesota, which represents a really cool southern periphery of the boreal forest. But the boreal forest is the second most altered habitat bird communities right now, especially affecting those cavity and secondary cavity users that rely on these older, mature forests for these structures. Within the boreal forest, about 30% of the boreal forest is wetlands. And within wetlands, we have this magical ecosystem called peatlands that I'm sure you've heard of. If you haven't heard of peatlands, really what peatlands are is this cool post-glaciation ecosystem where you have cold, you have a lot of water, you have cold ice, you have sphagnum moss, especially here in the north, with sphagnum moss peat's the most common one. And that sphagnum is also acidic. So as that sphagnum builds up, there's an increased water level, increased acidity. So decomposition really slows down to a point where it's actually halting. You really get this collection of carbon storage, which is what these peatlands are really famous for. How 3% of the planet's surface is covered in peatlands, but that stores 30% of our carbon, which is pretty awesome and pretty scary with the changes that are happening to these ecosystems, both with climate change and with management. A large part of these peatlands are forested peatlands, and a major representation of forested peatlands are black spruce peatlands. In Minnesota, we recognize 3 different cover types. This is really based on tree productivity. If you have, as your peat depth increases and your water table increases, you get more stagnant systems. Those trees can't put off that above ground biomass growth because of the waterlogged, so all that growth goes into root mass. And you see that driving potentially in the northern part of the state. You see a nice bog peatland with really short trees. Those short trees could be old growth forests though. So that water and that peat really affects the tree growth. My project and what I'm gonna be talking about the rest of the time is really focusing on productive black spruce because it's the most affected by management decisions that we're making currently. And one of the unique things about this ecosystem is that it goes from a really rate of slow disturbance rates. How typically the trees like black spruce, tamaracks, these other boreal species love to burn. They're really associated with fire. But what happens when you put them in a system where there's not a lot of fire? And you can get really cool, complex, interesting relationships from that. And we see that as a lot of species that are on the Minnesota Species of Greatest Conservation Concern, great gray owls, owl-sided flycatchers, Connecticut warblers, Canada jays, all call this ecosystem home. You also get that really cool mix of open bog habitat with these forests. So you get pitcher plants, rare orchids, you get canopy gaps that have really big bust of bog laurel that are in the spring are just beautiful and gorgeous, and the moths and the butterflies are really responding to those. And with this system, since it's mostly black spruce dominated, how do we know if it's old? We don't have hemlock trees or other these old like climax associated species to really go off of, but in the boreal forest, we really look at how complex is that forest. As you go through age, you get multiple age cohorts of trees. You can just imagine that system moving through time, the disturbances it receives, and how complex that can really get. That leads to my thesis. I really want to assess within this community how ecological succession affects the physical structure of the forest, affects the structure of the composition, both with species, overstored decay, tree microhabitat availability, and how that shapes the bird community, specifically how that really affects these habitat specialists that are really keying in on these structural features. So the next few slides are gonna go over some examples of some LiDAR derived images, and then some modeling done with this LiDAR on these specialists. So one cool thing we talked about the point cloud is you can really look at a point cloud and you can have a good idea of what stage of that succession that forest is in. You can see on the left, we have at the top a regen, a young, a mature forest, and an old growth forest approaching that stage. You can see that as you're going, the structure rises up. At mature, it's pretty even. As you get older, you start seeing those dips. You start seeing those canopy gaps. You see those mortality events associated with that structure complexity. You can also see that with the above view of a canopy height model. How with dark green being lower height, red being higher, as you get regen, it's a pretty simple, flat forest. It was clear cut, takes away a lot of that structure that birds and species really rely on. As that ages up, you increase the height. And also, as you get to old growth, you can see that it's really variable throughout here. It's not just tall trees. It's patches of openness. It's patches of mid-stage openness. And that really drives species presence and biodiversity. When we think about structural complexity, there are metrics we can measure complexity at that are used pretty widely throughout bird studies and forest studies. 3 of the major ones that we think about are canopy cover, rumple, and canopy heterogeneity. So canopy cover is, as it sounds, like how much of that canopy is covered, and how does that vary? This was that same stand that had that tamarack die-off event, and you can see on the bottom left of that stand on each of these metrics how LiDAR is showing that mortality event happening and that complexity of the structure. With rumple's a funny one to explain. It kind of makes sense, it kind of doesn't, but think of it as like the roughness of the surface with the roughness of the ground. So if you have areas where that topography is kind of rough and it matches with the roughness of the canopy, that increases your rumple value. In canopy heterogeneity, what's the standard deviation of those tree heights? How does that affect throughout a stand? That's going to change as we get into older successional stages. Okay, for the fun part, how does it relate to birds? So from Grindy et al., 2026, which is a paper in review, using these sites and some of the black spruce sites that I'm using for my study, we can see that these complexity metrics do have strong relationships with these specialist birds, especially in black spruce. We see that canopy cover has a positive relationship with, on the x-axis is stand age. So these represent as a forest gets older, we see that canopy cover, rumple, and canopy heterogeneity all increase, and that specialist species richness also is increasing with these metrics. And we see that dark green is productive black spruce, light green stagnant, and yellow is tamarack. And that, which kind of makes sense seeing this, as black spruce is going to have more structural complexity than tamarack, as tamarack in this system often represents a pioneer species, and often doesn't. As it ages out, black spruce comes in the mix more. We get those older forests being more black spruce. This looks pretty similar as well as we get into specialist diversity. As that forest gets older, we get an increased number of specialists with canopy cover increasing, with rumple increasing, and with canopy heterogeneity. It's kind of hard to see some of the cones with the confidence intervals with this, but as you get older with rumple, it really opens up and veers out, which sometimes statistics might say like, oh, you should look at that. But that's what old growth forest is. It's variable. It's not always these big, old, thick, dense forests. It's also small forests, medium forests, forests that are really open for a period of time. And I just want to highlight quick too, just as we look at this and we see that these values that older forests have with biodiversity, we have to really think about what we're doing to these older forests and how we're managing these landscapes, as these older forests are really important habitats for these species that we've decided we care about, and we want them to continue on the landscape. And that leads to my biggest takeaway with this is how LiDAR is really cool, and it gives us this really cool example of how to read a landscape. But there's structure features that LiDAR can't pick up. That's where in combining these metrics with going to the field, measuring, getting species composition, collecting information on habitats, on decay, and pairing that with LiDAR just gives us a better view of this forest or of a habitat that species are using. And that goes into a little bit of the one other part of my project is looking at tree microhabitats in decay stage and why these are important for birds. And we can think about if you have a tree snaps in half, that could be a good place for an owl to nest or a snag for perching, cavities for these cavity nesters that are being really affected by forest management, as well as caching, which is a major thing that these resident species do that's being affected by management. And we need to ask ourselves, like, if we value these species, we have to value the ecosystems they live in as well. And we need to really do a better job personally on taking care of these ecosystems and really looking out for and caring for these wide range of values in our society that go beyond timber. And with that, I just want to thank all our partners and funders for all these projects. The predecessors before me that really established this and gave me a really cool project to jump into. Thank everyone in the Avian Ecology Lab for all your inspiration and support. You're all super inspirational ecologists. I look up to all of you. The field techs like Peter, who'd gone out with me after point counts to go measure trees and put some really long days in these peatlands that are pretty tiring but pretty magical. And thank my advisor, Alexis, for letting me just pursue my passion project. And really just, instead of being like, do this, it's really just, how can I support you? Which is pretty cool to get into an advisor, and highly recommend that if you're looking for grad school. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Pretty fascinating. I'm wondering, is the LiDAR data that you're accessing, is it just flown over your specific spots, or I'm hoping that this would be a statewide mapping effort that a wide variety of studies could be done on. I'm thinking, for example, in Central and South America, it's been very successful in finding indigenous communities and old trade routes and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I forgot to mention that in the talk. So from 2020 to 2025, Minnesota had a statewide collection of high-density LiDAR that really gave me a perfect opportunity to get into my master's of having this recently collected high-density LiDAR data to use for habitat modeling. So if you're in any other part of the state, and from 2020 to 2025, and you have projects, there's free LiDAR available for you to use and to process and analyze. And there's different softwares. I use Fusion. There's also with RStudio, different ways of really diving in and analyzing this LiDAR. That's free, free access, and the software to analyze it is also free.
Can you hear me? There. You're working in black spruce forests. Black spruce is targeted for the Christmas treetop cutting. Are you seeing any impacts of that? I've talked to the foresters and they tell me not to worry because it just by taking off the top, the trees recover. But have you seen any impacts?
Yeah, it's actually pretty surprising when sometimes we'll be out pretty far into a bog, and you'll see saplings that are chopped in half at the top. And just from personal experience, I haven't seen too many of those regenerating back into full trees. So I think it's a pretty hard disturbance. It's a disturbance type that a human disturbance type we're introducing to this forest. That's pretty hard to keep track of and manage, but I think as we take more from these ecosystems, especially peatlands, which are really sensitive to disturbance, that our ability to know what the long-term impacts are vary. So I would say there probably is an impact from that. It's just we might need to wait 100, 200 years to find out.
I was curious, and the photographs in your comment, it seemed like it was always from airplanes, small planes.
Yep, this was collected from an airplane.
Can it be done with drones, or does it have to cover too large of an area? Or
Yes, it can. Actually, I'm sure some of you driving here today probably used LiDAR in your car. If your car has if you have cruise control and it's picking up a vehicle in front of it, that's LiDAR technology. There's LiDAR on our phones as well. But primarily it's used with airplane, but we also have ground-based terrestrial LiDAR. That's really cool if you want to capture that under that canopy view. That would probably be a little better tool for capturing understory canopy versus airborne LiDAR. But that can be put on drones or any other technology you can think of as well.
so for ground level, would it be like a ground vehicle?
It's almost like a box. You put this weird big box on the ground, start it up, and it takes a whole 360 scan underneath of that area.
I'll do this one first, Nick.
So does LiDAR able to capture the difference between a forest that's been selectively logged versus, say, an old growth type of forest?
You would probably want to pair that with on the land, actual if you could hit with a record, historical records or more of on the ground stuff. But you can see with LiDAR, you can see those difference if there was a logging operation. I'll just go back with this example. The region was a clear cut, and you can see that there isn't much structure on that stand. It's pretty flat, which birds don't really respond to that too well until you wait 20, 30, 60, 100 years later till you get those features on the landscape that they're relying to that are in the older and mature forest. So if you were logging and you had more selective group selections or you left a lot more space unlogged, that would match closer to the older, mature forests than it currently is being done.
Yeah, I think you just partially answered the question I was going to ask, but I was hoping you could talk about management actions that either you or others are studying to help these bog habitats speed up the rate at which they acquire those old growth type structures and habitat heterogeneity. Is that something people are actively doing, or just sort of conceptual, or are there opportunities that people could take advantage of to encourage more of that?
Currently, I know that there are a lot of foresters from different operations that would like to get more diverse with how they're logging. Unfortunately, there is some policy in Minnesota that really especially most of the black spruce in Minnesota is state-owned, and a lot of that is in school trust forest. Unfortunately, with school trust forest, Minnesota says that we want maximum economic value. So generally means clear cutting, and generally means if you identify mistletoe in a stand, which it really increases the biodiversity of a stand and changes that structure, that gets targeted specifically for logging. So with current policy and regulation, it kind of ties up the hands of foresters, but there's a lot of interest in changing that and really changing what we can do and how we manage this landscape.
Okay, one last question.
Hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, since LiDAR first came out, not long before I retired from the DNR, I thought there might be an opportunity to do something like what you are doing, which is really amazing. For the last 20 years, the DNR has been struggling with de-identifying, and they may have completed it by now, old-growth lowland conifers, because the state owns a lot. And the data that were available was basically aerial photographs and stand data that approximated the age. But this type of LiDAR information would be perfect for what the goals of that program are. And maybe there's someone from the DNR who knows more what's happening now. But it's really great work, and I'm glad to see technology advancing here.
Thank you.